Thank you very, very much, Terry, for that kind introduction of, I mean, when you're nearly 70 years of old, you've got to have done something, I suppose. So it's easy to fill up with a whole lot of bits and pieces. But I'm very privileged to be in front of an august group, as you are, as Nuffield scholars and Nuffield board members and people who have done so much to develop leadership in agriculture and the management of the landscapes, not only in Australia but right around the world, and foster excellence in agriculture. So I do thank you, and I thank Jim and Nicola who have made it possible for me to be here tonight and to make sure all the arrangements work. So I do thank you very, very much for that. I guess that at this time of night it's pretty hard when you probably all would just like to have a glass of wine and probably go to sleep or go to bed or do something else rather than listen to a bald old man trying to make some sense of how we manage water in the Murray-Darling Basin. I've done some strange things in my time trying to speak, but the worst and most taxing exercise was following a belly dancer, and that worked out, so maybe tonight will. So what we want to do tonight is to have a bit of a look at the history and building a future in the Murray-Darling Basin, with recognising that we probably have to build that future with a great deal less water extraction than we currently do. And I want to just use some of the scientific basis for what I think is the causal issue and what we need to do, and we have to face up to some pretty hard stuff, and the Wentworth group has had to say things that are difficult. And in a way it's been part of the journey is to try and find ways to constructively speak truth to power. That's not a trivial matter, and it sounds a bit arrogant to say it in some ways, but science does have to say what science says. It has to do it with a certain courtesy, but it also has to do it with a sense of humility, because science only knows what it knows until it knows what it knows is not true. If you can follow that, that's what Popper taught us, that we can't prove something to be true, we can only prove that it is untrue. So that's the basis of what I want to do. There's two really key reasons why we need to have water reform in the basin. But to me, and from an agricultural perspective, the first is that if we can find a way to have a sustainable, healthy river and food production from that river that is sustainable, we'll be one of the few countries in the world who can say we can do it. If you look around the world, nearly every irrigation system and every river system that irrigation is derived from is not in a healthy condition. The Colorado River has no flow, basically, to the Mexican Gulf. And you go around the world, you'll find similar. And we're trying to do something that is particularly innovative, but it's important because if we can do that, we'll be able to have a badge for the Australian product that very few other countries in the world will be able to have. The second thing is that if we get our take in line with the capacity, it provides greater security for all those people in the industry itself. Those alone should be two good reasons why we should do what I'll talk about now. So we're going to have to move fairly quickly because I don't want to keep you here long. I've tried, and I apologise if the talk's a bit long, but I'll go quickly as possible. Let's have a look at the Murray River. Let's see if this will work. There we go. Okay, we'll just put it down. So this is the story. So this is the river, the beautiful river. Pictures of it. Mike. Oh yeah, let me go this way. Okay, I'll operate like this. So if we look here, we see, let's go back a bit and have a look. This is the recreational value of the river. This is the irrigation value of the river. This is the river in the foreground, and you see the floodplain and the billabong areas wet to the top of the picture. Very important part of our process. Our rivers are fluvial floodplain rivers. They look like that. Sometimes they look like this, and that's okay too. Is that a little too close?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there we go. Is that fine? Can you hear me? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and they do look quite beautiful in the evening, and of course this is what the Murray looks like often at the bottom of it during the drought. But the Murray-Darling is a system that really needs to be recognised, that it's two drivers to that system. One is the northern river, the Darling, and you see the amounts of the thickness of those lines you see on the blue lines that you see on that picture give you some indication of the amounts of water. So where's the water in the Murray-Darling? Only really in two places, in the Murrumbidgee and the Murray. That's where the water is. So if we're going to have to bring about change and reform, those two places will be the place where the pain will be greatest. Doesn't mean that the Darling's delivery is not important, and that delivery can be absolutely important to the bottom of the Murray. But let's go back and let's look. The thing that characterises the thing is something that you all know better than I. That's the variability, that's the anomaly. So the reds are the dry years, the blues are the wetter years. And you can see the last 2 years are probably the wettest two sequences we've had in the period of record. But the bottom line is that this is a highly variable system, and learning to live in that variability and maintain the health of the river, where it needs to be dry sometimes and it needs to be very, very wet sometimes, is the challenge in front of us. But let's have a look at these two pictures here and those two circles. You see the bottom one is the actual rate at which we increased our investment in storage capacity, and where that occurred. Of course, occurred at a time when we had those 1950s, 60s and into the 70s very wet sequences. The system was filled, it worked, but the coinciding of the building of the system and the big rainfall events is very striking. That has implications for, well, maybe it worked in those wet times, is it going to work for all the other times? And they could have been, if we'd have done the same dam building in the first 50 years of Federation, we'd have had a very different story than we've had by dam building in the second 50 years of Federation. And of course, that's another way of looking at the flow, and you can see those dry periods we've had at the turn of the century during the 30s and 40s, and the very dry period we've just come out of. And if you look at the long-term flow, you can see it looks like the animation's not operating now. Well, we'll get there. You can see that if you look at the natural flow, where I've indicated, and then the observed flow, and then the stimulated flow for a climate change scenario that's fairly moderate, you see that what we've had in our observations currently and what we'd have under current climate change scenario are not unsimilar. But you can see the very big difference from the natural flow systems to the flow of the systems that we have. Substantial. And of course the important thing is to look at the way, and this was in this earlier graph, the way actually we extracted and built our irrigation systems in the Murray-Darling system. The growth in water use in the Murray-Darling, you see, had this big expansion post-war, and it kept on going through the 70s. And we then had in '94 a courageous decision to put on what is called the cap. And you see the flow to the sea, there's about 14,000 gigalitres, and the cap came in at about 11,600 gigalitres. Those are numbers you might want to hold in your head. And of course, the issue was, what did the cap really mean? It meant that the key message is that the available water was heavily utilised and very small volumes left to ensure a healthy river system. Well, we know that, and I think society as a whole has recognised that, and certainly the Water Act and both sides of politics agreed to that when the Act was passed back in 2008. But we have a look at this situation again, and this is the way where the natural flow to the river is. You see that vertical line, and that's the build-up in storage capacity across the basin, the public and the private. And I guess that's just appreciate that the consequence of that is that to make irrigation work in Australia with a high variability, we have to store at least at 50 to 80% above the greater than the average flow. And if you've got any chance of managing the carryover to provide an ability to cope with climate. So we've got river systems that have got big storages relative to their actual flows by world standards. And that's necessary to cope with the variability they talked about earlier. But the consequence is something like this. This is the flow at the Murrumbidgee at Balranald. And you see that the first picture is the inflow of the river, which is the top graph over the last period. And we see that it's a declining thing, and at this date it would be better if I had another few more years, but I haven't. I've got it up to 2007. And then, of course, this is the actual water used in the Murrumbidgee for irrigation, and you'll see whilst the inputs have been falling, we've managed to maintain the water for irrigation at that sort of level. And then, of course, this last curve at the bottom is the actual outflow from the Murrumbidgee through Balrimble into the Murray system. And you see that it's been in continuing decline, and so in the end we've got a river that very little flow from it. We've taken it all for our human need in irrigation. It's important in this picture to have a look. This is basically says what the actual, I'd rather look at you than that. So this shows that under the natural picture, pre-development, historical climate, what happened to water. You can see over the side the consumptive, the environment and the flow to the sea. So we went from the 52% that was actually flow to the sea under the current historical climate, and the actual flow, we've gone from flow to the sea from 52 to 20%, and we've gone from that water that can be used in environmental purposes from 48 to 32. That's the sort of change. The other thing that is important, that under current climate and recent climate, the flow has fallen down to 13%. And then we've got on the right-hand side what it would be under a climate change scenario in 2030. And you can see that what we've been through is not unsimilar to what we can expect due to climate change. So keep that in mind. Okay, that's the bottom line, is that the recent drought is a lot like what we anticipate in the 2030 climate change. Now it's important to sort of have a look at this graph here and see that if you look at under the climate with irrigation, you can see the inflows, the extractions and the end of system flows. And then you can have a look with no irrigation what that same period would have looked like. The inflow is obviously the same. With no extractions, you can see how the end of system flows was being reduced by about 7,500 gigalitres per year. And of course that's something like our take. So that's the sort of numbers that we have in mind. I guess you can see again, this is at Wentworth and the Murray flow, the difference between the natural flows, the natural flow, oops, let me go back, the natural flows up there and the observed flows down there. So that's the system we've built. And then another way of looking at as to see what's been flow at the Murray mouth since 1980 right through to 2007 or 8. You can see the huge decline that we've had during the drought, as you might expect, but the high fluctuations we've had in the other periods. So that's the story that we have to try and manage. And this graph here then I think is the last one, but I want to give some facts to my assertions, that this is what comes into the system up here, this is what goes out of the system down here, and this is the stuff that we use. Now by use it's the surface water diversions, but of course we all get benefits from the fact that we have evaporation and water losses and groundwater recharge and floodplain ecosystems, as well as the evaporation from reservoirs and lakes. And you can see, oops, let me go back and then I'll press the wrong button here. The evaporation from lakes, you see, is not a trivial term. This term here has some of the recharge, but you get a sense of the ins and the outs and the sorts of magnitudes that we're talking about. So that's important to understand all that. Now, what's the consequence of what we've been doing is that if you actually look at the river health across the system and the health rating, we've only got one river in the system, the Paroo, that's in good condition. Most are very poor, and that's pretty well documented repeatedly by every group who actually does use the Sustainable Rivers Audit. That's the state of the river system, and that's a measure of the biological, the hydrological, the chemical and water quality of these river systems. So we've got a problem, and you can see the reason why when you saw how we've changed the flow regime. So what's the sort of thing we're trying to do with these rivers? Well, rivers have this issue that our rivers are generally floodplain rivers. A river at the top of the system, like this one here, will be a little bit of exchange in the riparian zone, in and out between the river channel itself and the small floodplain, but not much. But when you come down the system like here, we see you've got a great deal of exchange between the flooding and the river, because it's the water going out into the system, ecosystems developing, the photosynthesis takes place, this is where a lot of the plants are, then it flows back to the river. And that provides the carbon and the energy that drives the ecology of the river. That's our rivers, because they're largely floodplain rivers. Let's keep looking at the picture, and that's another way of saying as you go further down the system, you've got this very important exchange, the billabongs, wetlands, and that exchange backwards and forwards between the river is something that happens in our rivers that are critical, and trying to get a sustainable agriculture that works in line with that functionality is the challenge of the water reform. Another way of looking at it in a horizontal picture is to see this sort of, where's that gone? Anyhow, you can see that you've got the main channel here, high flow channel there, the outer branches, the wetlands, the backwaters and the billabongs, and how this flooding over there is critical to the recharge of the system, to groundwater recharge and subsequent discharge. So that's the system. Then if you look at it in plan again, it gives you the same sort of recognition, and most of you folks who grow up in these things understand that the main channel isn't the full story. And it's not the same as taking this area here in a wetland and a backwater and pumping some water into it and wetting it. It's the pack that goes out and back and through, and this transfer through these vegetation where the photosynthesis is happening, the nutrient is available, where the carbon is captured, the food chain is built, is the dominant thing that is critical to the future. Now let's have a look at what that looks like. This is part of a system in the Wakul area, I think it's Wakul, I'm not terribly where in the dry time, and this is a flow channel. Then if we look at it with a flow, we see it do this. I mean, you can actually see this bit of mistletoe. Just keep your eye on that bit of mistletoe there. As we go through the sequence, you can see that's what it looks like with the flow, and you see the regeneration that takes place in these red gums systems. And then you see after the water's gone, that's what it does revert to. And of course, this is what it looks like in a real flood, and that's what it was like in 2011. So that's the sort of to flood a floodplain, you've got to have a depth of water over an area, which gives you the volume. So it isn't that complicated in the end of the day. So when we look at the Murray-Darling again, this slide just gives you an indication once again of the fact that this is where the water is down here. There's all the storages, those triangles give you an indication of how regulated a system we have. No big problem with that, we've just got to learn to manage it so the river is healthy as possible and sustainable, and we're also producing the food, some of which we've just consumed. So that's the system. Okay, let's go further. But the big question I want to talk about tonight, and I know most people do, is how do we in Wentworth come up with what we need? How much water is needed? Well, as I said, the volume needed to add a given depth to a specific area is the first point if you're going to flood floodplains. And so a given depth is equal to the water requirement. Most red gums and wetlands need an ET of about, evapotranspiration of about 750 mils. Much of the basin has an average of say 450 mils. So as a rough approximation means we've probably got to add 300 mils of depth over the floodplain. So therefore the calculation becomes therefore 100,000 hectares. You can do the sums yourself, needs 300 gigalitres to wet it. So if you've got 100,000 hectares of millable forest, then you're going to have to put 300 gigalitres on if you want to give it 30 mils of water, and an irrigator knows that. No big deal. So if you've got in the basin something like 5,600,000 hectares of wetlands or floodplain vegetation across the basin, then it's fairly obvious that for that to happen, you're going to have a volume requirement of something like 16,800 gigalitres. So if you really want to wet the flood, you've got to put the whole flood of those big flow systems through the thing. We're unlikely to do that. So what's the reasonable sort of number you can look at? Well, it's pretty easy if you actually do that and create a graph. The volume required, if you think that we can look at the approximate area of wetlands is right up there, and that needs the 16,000. This is a very preliminary, simple calculation, but It'll give you the ballpark figures. And you'll see that if you say, well, we can afford to water 1.6 million hectares, we're going to have 5,000 gigalitres. Now, you can't wet an area to a known depth without that volume. If you can, tell me how you stretch water. So that's the call of the day. But that's not, of course, a very sophisticated and proper calculation. It just gives you a ballpark steady state where you might. Because how much water is needed? Well, this is stuff that Barry Hart has helped me with. And so that in the baseline, this is probably what it looked like without development. We had a great big sized wetland under the baseline in our current. This maybe was wetted one event in every 2 years. Now a much smaller area is invented one event in 7 years. So we've changed the system. So the aim, of course, is to try and bring us into some sort of alignment. Well, can we stretch it and make it a bit bigger and maybe have an event one every 5 years? That's what a sustainable diversion limit scenario is trying to do. Okay, let's go on a bit further. But how much water is needed? Well, this is the history of the number calculation game, and it's all based on the best we know at the time. I gave you a hugely simplistic model to have a think about, just to put it on the table. But the first piece of work back in 2002 was when we sat down with an expert panel under Gary Jones's leadership and sort of worked out, well, what's the number? Well, what are we going to do? And for the Murray River only, he came up with, to be certainly sure, with a high level of likelihood of success, you needed around 4,000 gigalitres. Then in 2008, we did the best we could using E-water CRC calculator, E-predictor and other techniques. We came up with some sort of number like that for the whole basin. Then we did some more work using different tools, and this time we ended up feeling the best justification we can use is simply to say we need to have 2/3 of natural flow. If we have 2/3 of natural flow, this is the sort of number, 4,400 gigalitres, which is what Wentworth believes is the sort of order we ought to know. But we really need to have the scientific work done so that we all, as Australians, know what the science says. Unfortunately, we're not in a position, we don't have that information. We should have had it, we haven't. The next best estimate was after that. Then in October 2010, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority put out the guide to the plan. And it said, well, this is the range from 3,000 to 7,600. And that caused enormous, no one took any notice of what Wentworth said, and that's fair enough. But the basin had a number like this, and of course that's probably the best modelling that we had at that time, because it was a model where you actually ask the question, what's the amount of water we need to wet these assets sufficiently to bring about ecological value? And that's where they got to. And what we needed to do then is continue that work and test that work and expose it to rigorous and transparent scientific review. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Instead, in my view, what we've had is the next thing, the first plan that comes out, we get a number, I don't know, I can't see that with nice funny eyes. We get a number of the 2750, which from a scientific view comes out of the air as far as I'm concerned. Because now the models are used to say, I put this much water into the model, what does it wet? So you keep on putting different numbers into the model and you get a different answer. If you ask a silly question, you'll get a silly answer. So it's that sort of thing. So that's where we are today. Now that's putting it simply and late at night. I'm happy to debate the detail of that, or not debate it, but explain it best I understand it. But then, and just recently, the Basin Authority has modelled the number of 3,200. And at the same time it's modelled that, it's also removed a great deal, 8 of the major constraints that were in the system in the 2750 that were constraining the flooding patterns that you could have. We had bridges and infrastructure and private land that couldn't be flooded, so therefore you couldn't use the water and you couldn't get the ecological outcome. That raises a fundamentally important question in terms of public policy to me. If the taxpayer pays for water to use for common good environmental outcome, we ought to be able to use it for that. But at the moment, in the current planning system, that may not be so. So a water entitlement doesn't entitle you to flood private land. So how do you work through to get through this? So at the moment we've got the legal and the hydrological definition of how we use water far from clear. Yet we're about to have a plan which will nail it down, and I think set up a whole lot of legal argument that will go on for a long time. We'll have spent the money and we won't have got the environmental outcome. Let's hope I'm wrong. So the next picture shows, well, that's of course what the first report of Jones was, that independent study back in 2002, and it looked at the things of flow volume, the flow distribution, the flow variability, how well it was connected between the river channel and the floodplain, and the quality of the system and the flushing of the salt. And the actual result, this is just taken out of their report. This is their report, and back in that period, and you can see that's, if you want a moderate likelihood, you need 1950. This is for the Murray alone. It's not for the whole system. And that 3200 modelling that I said that Basin's just done was only for the Murray too. And then if you wanted a high level of probability, you needed 4,000 for the Murray alone. The interesting thing is that the Murray River system assets was only for the living Murray. The fact is, what did we end up with? But only 500 gigalitres were actually achieved. That was the policy house, came from the figures of 4,000 with a high level of likelihood of success, or 2,000 if you want a moderate likelihood of success, but in the end we chose 500. So that's the story. So we then in Wentworth went into using the E-flow predictor with CRC, and we used that to produce our report in 2010. Which we then concluded using, based on the 2/3 of their natural flow, and there's literature to support that's not being unreasonable for a floodplain river. It's rough, it's the beginning, but there is some literature to support it, and we felt that was a better basis than we couldn't use the E-flow predictor, because the detailed information was just horrendous and beyond our capacity in Wentworth to manage, and E-water didn't have the resources to do it, and there we go. So how much water is needed? Well, we came up with a 4,400 long-term cap equivalent, which meant a sustainable diversion limit of around 7,170 gigalitres. Now that's a big reduction. It's a huge change. But we need to know what the scientific answer is. That's our best estimate at that time. And I guess that it's not too difficult to realise that the two places where that has to come from, if you're going to get the water, has to come from the Murray system and the Murrumbidgee. And the changes are big. And the cost and impact on people is very significant and needs to be managed if you seriously want water reform. And I think that's the thing that we argued in our report, that we needed to be looking at those two things. We needed to be getting the water, but spending much more of the money in assisting community with soft and heavy, hard infrastructure to manage the adjustment to living with that change, because it's a huge change. No one pretended it was going to be easy, and it's proven not to be easy. And it's a huge challenge for a society to bring a major river system like the Murray-Darling Basin into some level of health and be able to say yes and still produce the food and fibre we need. Anyhow, I can't go into the economics tonight because I can see some people asleep, and I'll keep on going. But let's go back to the table. Yes, I wonder if we all should stand up and then all stand down again, but I don't think I'll do that because you'll all walk out. So look, here's the picture again of how we actually have used water in the system over time. That was the cap, which we talked about. That's the sort of number that Wentworth's talking about, and there's a big difference, eh? Now, the number that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is arguing for at the moment sits around about the 8,000. So, in some ways, the debate's over this. But that's where it is now. And, but the big issue is, I'll come to it, we haven't talked about groundwater, and we need to do that. All right, so then there's the guide to the basin plan, which we come to, and I want to go through that quickly. It basically said it was from 3,000 to 7,600, and it said we needed to do more work to tidy that down. But then we had a change in game plan, and we Well, there are all the numbers just to say how it worked. You can have a look at it, but the principal figure is in this sort of figure. This is the probability of exceedance across the bottom, and this is the actual flow at a particular site. And what you're trying to do in the method they use, which scientifically was reviewed and shown to be valid, it was the only bit that has been properly scientifically reviewed in my view, in terms of the question. And so the shaded area represents the volume of additional water required by the environment. So this is the system now. This is what it would have been under natural systems, this top line. And then this is what we're trying to do it to bring it into some level of adjustment. We may not ever going to get up to the top line. What's the sort of number between there and there? So this is with a high level of probability of success, and this is with a much lower level. Recognise this is a logarithmic graph, so always be careful when you look at a graph, what's the axis? Of course you all know that. People play games. I hope I'm not. Now, what this shows in this graph here, at late at night, and I shouldn't even probably show, I should skip it, but I think you guys are on top of it, you wanted to know what the story is. The proportion without development frequency, so how often have we got to have these systems? And it looks somewhere between 60 and 80% of the natural occurrence will give you a reasonable level of health for all these different systems throughout the system. So if you're between 60 and 80% of the natural frequency of wetting or the natural area of wetting, you'll probably get. So that, to me, looks like some level of evidence for the 2/3 rule which Wentworth used. And that was quite independently done. But it illustrates again the problem of looking at, if you're looking at an area for red gums, 30, this is what you need, 40 gigalitres for 30 days. I found some people in the bureaucracies would write it down as 40 gigalitres for 30 days, or 60 gigalitres for 60 days, or 80 gigalitres a day for 30 days, and never multiply the two numbers together. Because if you don't multiply them together, you don't realise how much damn water there is. And really that's been a bit of a sleight of hand that's gone on in discussion repeatedly. People will talk about flow per day for so many days and not multiply it together, because that gives you a number. How to do the sums yourself. Anyhow, that's the story. So then we had the first of the Basin plans, proposed plans in 2011, and it says all the good things that it wants to do, and then it sort of illustrates in the plan the fact that the difference between planned environmental water, water that floods naturally, or held environmental water, these definitions, whilst they can be written in a sentence, when you put them into legal form, there are some real questions. And if you've now got a Commonwealth water holder who's got something like over 100 different titles of water, how to put that mix and match together to get the environmental outcome, I really don't know, and I don't see why we should have a basin plan until those are actually sorted out. So the volume of the resource, this is the thing that comes down to. How are we going to think about using our water resources? Well, do we really believe that the healthy river needs a first call? New Zealanders believe that, but I don't think Australians do generally. So if you say, well, user entitlements, and see them as a share in a major resource. It's like a share in a company, okay? So that then you say, well, what a river needs will move up and down as the climate's change and new knowledge affected. Also, we'll get movement backwards and forwards here between season and climate variation. So the actual area in this triangle here is what you have to use. This is the actual user entitlement, that's your share, but what you actually get is the dividend every time, and the dividend depends on the performance. Now that model isn't quite the model we've got, but it's some way towards what we've got, so that you're talking about the actual volumetric water that you get as separate from the entitlement, and that being based around that effort. Okay, well that's a complication, but let's go forward. And I think when we look at water for the environment, sorry guys, when you look, the two buttons are very close and I've got old and big thumbs. The two water, you've got the consumptive use share, the flood water, the environmental share, but there's all this here that's the maintenance water. You need water in the channel to deliver water. You can't deliver water without having water in a channel, and you're going to have evaporation. You need to have the recharge to the groundwater system. Is that the environments, or is that the consumptive share that someone has later down the system? How do you manage flow? So those are some of the issues that are still in my mind. But anyhow, where we stand at the moment is that we have the reduction in surface water by 2750 gigalitres a year, but we have this great increase in the first proposal of 2600 gigalitres per year of groundwater. And yet we've had CSIRO and SKM and other people show that in fact the groundwater systems should be probably capped in the basin. Yet now we have a case put, but the science behind that is extremely loose and I think open to a huge debate, and I would certainly say, and I think it needs to be scrutiny. That number has subsequently now been reduced in the recent versions of the plan to something like 1600. How did we make the change? What's the basis of it? I understand it was the basis of a one-day workshop. I think we can do better than that with our science. So, okay, so this is the sort of thing that we've collected this benefit, 800 gigalitres so far. By the end of September, according to this, we should have 1,000. And where does that take us? So we're making progress. So we've got to find, if you go to the Basin plan, something of the order of another 1,500 gigalitres. All right, let's go. It's the hydrology of the basin. You've seen that before. It's the north and the south, and the sort of take with the current proposal is 143 from the north and something like 971 from the southern two rivers, the Murrumbidgee and the Murray. So I guess this is what it looks like. If you look at the sort of numbers here, you see you've got the interceptions that are on the plain. Now that still is an issue to me because we're still seeing conversion of interceptions on the floodplain being converted to tradable licence. That's interesting. Is it consistent across the basin? No. So that's an issue. Then, oh, dear, I'm sorry. Let me go. Yeah, okay. So this figure in here is what the debate, and we'd argue, is the additional environmental water need. But this is all called environment water, and this is for Barry Hart, who gave me the diagram that's used in the basin. I'm grateful to him for that. But there's a whole lot of function in there. That's got water that actually is in the delivery of the water to the system, and also the recharge to the aquifers. And that's something we need to think about. So I'm looking pretty worried when I see us operating at that. So water in the environment include lots of services which support diversions, evaporation by non-irrigated vegetation, recharge, transport, all the rest. So when we come back to the issue, and this seems to be the reasonable balancing act, that we're going to look at the key ecological assets, the key ecological functions, the hydrological functions, and this, we put this together to work out the ecological water requirements. And then I'm very relaxed between the legal system constraints and the socio-economic. We come up with what we're prepared to do as a society. But this here, we should know what it is. We should know what the actual river system needs. All sorts of work's been done on it, but we don't have, in my view, an adequately defined analysis that's been subject to transparent review scientifically to know what actually the system needs, so that we then can genuinely engage in the socio-economic assessment, the legal issues, and so on. So we can engage here and here to come up with this number. This number will be, after all, a judgment after these two have been defined. But this, when you mix all this up and the number appears in the thin air, then I don't think that's helpful in the basic debate. So we do have a recognition of all these issues that come to bear, and I don't want to go into it. What are my conclusions? Well, clearly the science base for a sustainable diversion limit is not established as required by the Act. It's not subject to transparent review. There's a large increase in groundwater extraction that no science to justify. The surface and groundwater are not linked, and yet anyone in this room recognises it's the flooding of the floodplain that recharges the groundwater for the base flow to the river and the groundwater for our irrigation. The constraints to the use of water for flooding and gaining ecological function. What constraints in? Does a little bridge near Gundagai mean we can't flood it? Should we rebuild it? Should we invest in the infrastructure that's in the basin? The basin infrastructure was there to maximise irrigation. It wasn't to build healthy rivers. How much of the infrastructure? We've got floodplains that have channelized to provide rapid transport of water to the irrigation systems. Now we need to flood floodplains. There's a whole lot of issues there of how we need to re-engineer the basin to give healthy rivers and productive agriculture and how to get that best and most efficient balance. And I still think those questions are outstanding. And then I think the legal and hydrological definitions in a flooded river system are far from resolved. That's where I think we are. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.